Hi there, my name is Ian Berry and welcome to another candid and convivial conversation. For about 25 years now, I've been working with business leaders, executives, leaders of all shapes and sizes in all countries to help them to thrive on the challenges of change simply, profoundly and profitably. And one of the things that I work on with most of my clients is a phenomenon that's out there today, and that's the phenomenon of story sharing. I call it story sharing as different to telling. And my guest today is one of Australia's great storytellers and best-selling author, Andrew Griffiths. So Andrew, welcome.
G'day, Ian. Wonderful to be here. Thank you very much. What a wonderful topic to be here talking about too, hey?
Fantastic.
Story sharing. It's a nice way. It's a nice term, isn't it? You know, when we're so driven these days towards storytelling, for whatever sense it is. But yeah, I like it.
I agree, and I think and what I work with my clients on is being story sharers of significance.
Yeah, great term. Great term.
I think a lot of people are telling stories, a lot of people are sharing stories, but are they helping people to shift is another question. So the stories have got to be significant to the listener.
Yeah, great point again, isn't it? And it's probably, I'm sure we'll get around to that kind of point, but there's a lot of different angles around it, isn't it? You know, what are the stories we need to be able to tell? Where do we start? All that kind of stuff rolled into one. But it's certainly a hot topic. You know, there seems to be, it's like we've just found it again, but of course, storytelling's been around for 40,000 years, or ever since mankind's been on the planet. In many respects, they've been telling stories, but it feels like we've just found it again. For some reason, it's just been reinvented. Or perhaps sometimes I think people are a bit dismissive of it too, because they think, it's almost telling stories. Who really cares? Like in a corporate environment or in a, you know, as a speaker yourself, that the greatest presenters are the ones who tell the best stories. So that's what we're always trying to do, is to keep that happening.
No doubt.
Yeah.
In fact, I was having a conversation earlier today, Andrew, with an aspiring speaker, and we were talking about this very thing. And he asked me for my best advice after 25 years of telling stories, sharing stories. And I said to him, the best thing that I can share with you is a story has got to be the kind of a story that other people feel themselves in.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's very true, isn't it? In terms of even a written story, I know from my writing, in terms of books, I tell a lot of stories, use a lot of examples and anecdotes, and the reason I do that is so that people can put themselves in that picture. It's rather, if you write a third-person anecdote around, I was working with a butcher, and his biggest problem was he had plenty of customers, but at times the shop got so busy, he got a bit overwhelmed and felt bad because he couldn't kind of give everyone the attention that they needed. If someone's in that same situation where they feel like they can't give all their customers the same attention because they're busy or whatever, they relate to that much more than saying, do you feel like you don't give your customers the attention they deserve? And that's how I see, story sharing working really, really well.
Yes, I first saw it as a phenomenon a long time ago, and then I read a book by Stephen Denning that you might have come across. Stephen was ex-World Bank, and he was involved with Shell's scenario planning, idea many years ago. And although that book was a great book, and I'm pretty sure a best-selling book, it's probably 13 or 14 years ago it came out.
Okay.
But I think there was a lot of interest. Now we've got this huge amount of interest. And so my first question to you, Andrew, is, where do you start?
I think that's the hardest thing about it, isn't it? I guess there's a couple of different elements of that. For me, if I go way back, I've been telling stories all my life, and I never really realised it. I mean, as in to illustrate points or to get ideas across. I used to teach people how to dive. That was my first business, was a scuba diving shop, and I remember the way that you used to get attention was to tell people stories about the dive that I went on and an experience I had, because all everyone wanted to know about was sharks.
Yes.
Okay, that was their biggest concern, was sharks. So the minute you say, righto guys, after this break, I'm going to tell you a story about a shark, of course you've got everyone's immediate attention. Everyone's engaged. Everyone's buying into it from that. So over the years, I've told storytelling in that environment, in presenting, in writing, in all different types of areas. And when I'm kind of asked a bit about, well, where do you start with storytelling? I think that there's two angles that I always like to go. And I saw this on a TEDx talk, which was described wonderfully well. And the first part is the key to capturing an audience is you got to know your audience.
Yeah.
So you really got to know who you're telling your story to, because I think a lot of the time people tell stories, but there's no relevance. And it's kind of like, well, like, why are you telling me this story? And the second part, which I think is genius and very important, is you've got to start with what the audience knows. So to use an illustration for that, if I'm talking to a group of small business owners, for me, generally, I will tell them a story about my first business. And I'll tell them that I bought a business. I had no idea what I was doing. I made every mistake known to mankind. I knew my bank manager because every morning he came by and gave me back the checks that I'd bounced the day before. And all of a sudden, my audience understood that I got it. They knew that I knew them. They knew that they knew that I was on the same page as them, all of that kind of stuff. And that starting with what the audience know is a really important element. So I think for anyone who's saying, okay, well, I need to tell stories in my business or in my presenting or whatever it is I'm doing, well, that's what it covers. You've got to start with what they know, and you've got to know who you're talking to. And that's why we know, as being speakers, one of the first questions that you would always ask your clients, same as that I would do, is tell me about your audience. How old are they? What are the demographics? Are they male or female? What are their problems? What's their age group? What's their position in life? Are they struggling? Are they, tell me everything you can about my audience, and then I can deliver a good presentation to suit that audience. And people don't do that enough, I don't think. No,
and in fact, I just was remembering there that Nancy Duarte, who you would know or have heard of, she talks about, it's, when you're presenting, whether that's to a big audience, a small audience, or just one-on-one, it's really a transition, she calls it, from what is to what can be. But so many speakers I've heard, they start with what can be, therefore they lose the audience, rather than starting with what is, which is what your story about your own business and all that is.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's no possible way to engage the audience, or the audience are disconnected from the start. And I think, again, that moral, though, applies to storytelling in so many different areas as well. I think that, like people, when you talk about your business, something I think we touched on last time we spoke was that so many businesses go out of their way to tell their potential customers how they're the same as every other competitor. So you go to every accountant site, they'll tell you how they're the same as everyone else. They do tax, they do this, they do planning. You go, well, every accountant does that. Or you go to every financial planner site, and they'll tell you they're going to help you to build a solid future and, protect you, and all the same kind of words. So really, as a consumer, how do you decide which one to use? There's really nothing, because they're all offering the same. We're all telling everyone how we're the same. Being able to tell a story about your business and about why you started your business and about what you believe in and what you stand for and all the rest of it, that is how people can form an opinion and have a point of differentiation about why they should use you, as opposed to why they should, use someone else. And that's, I see so much practical application, Ian, for storytelling. It's not just for us as speakers standing in front of a room of 1,000 people. I use storytelling in mentoring, in webinars, in writing, in describing my business, or trying to get a point across to clients, or and people that I'm, whatever the role. To me, I don't see any differentiation when it comes to storytelling. I think you use it throughout all of those arenas.
You do, and even in the coffee shop. I mean, as I wasn't in a coffee shop this morning when I was talking to this aspiring speaker, but he said to me, well, where do you get your stories from? And I said, mate, I've had 10 stories come my way this morning and I haven't left the house.
Well, it's such a great point, because a lot of the time you have people say to you, oh, I haven't got any stories. I haven't got any stories that I can share. And I go, seriously? And I said, okay, I'm sure you have. I'm sure you've got experiences. I've yet to meet anyone who hasn't got any stories, but they don't have to actually be yours. I'm not saying go and plagiarize, but I'm saying by being observant, you see stories, you see anecdotes. I've got an example of this. I just finished reading this fantastic book. It's called No Mercy. And I don't think I spoke about this with you before, but I talk about it to a lot of people. It's just the most bizarre and wonderful book, Ian. It's written by two ladies, and
I'm going to jot down. The title's already got me intrigued.
No Mercy. And what it is it's these tales of disaster where people have kind of ended up stranded on an island or whatever the case may be, and ultimately things go ugly. You know, things turn bad, and the whole concept around this is they talk about plane crashes, they talk about shipwrecks in the 1800s. People stuck in the polar caps, etc., etc. And it's not just to shock you; it's actually a human behavioural book. So they turn around and go, okay, well, this is what happens when a group gets stranded. Within a matter of minutes, when everyone goes, uh-oh, things have turned bad, and like, this is a bad situation, we're stuck here, no help's going to come tomorrow, that the group automatically figures out who's the strongest and who's the weakest. Now, and you know who the strongest is, and you know who the weakest is. Now, the weakest knows they're the weakest, and they also know that bad things happen to the weakest, so they don't go to sleep anymore. So, of course, they don't sleep. They're the weakest, and ultimately the weakest gets eaten when things turn bad up. Now, you go, well, it's a really interesting kind of a story, great information about Lord of the Flies and all that stuff. But what I've done is I've turned that into a corporate keynote, because at the end of the book, they've got these 10 summaries. This is what to do if you end up in a disaster. You know, and it's like, and there are 10 points out there. I said, this is exactly the same as if you're in a corporate disaster. So, you know, how to avoid getting eaten if you're in a corporate disaster. And draw on this wonderful story. Rule number 1, you know, remove all alcohol. You know, and go, well, that's probably pretty good advice. You know, rule number 2, keep everyone busy. You know, rule number 3, if the leader is being ineffective, pick a new leader. You know, and it was kind of like, well, you know, there's things that wouldn't happen in that environment, but there's also a wonderful story around that. So I guess the moral to my story is that there are lots and lots of places where you get stories and examples from. It doesn't have to be something that happened to you when you were a kid or something that happened to you when you were in business. But I'm a bit like you. I keep a list of stories, and I see hundreds of opportunities for stories and things, you know, that you can use in your own kind of process. All day, every day. It's just thinking a little bit differently, isn't it? That's probably the key to that.
It is. Now, do you have a way of, when you observe a situation, read a book or hear, do you have a way of then turning that into a story that you can share, you know, more powerfully? Do you have a process?
Sure. Yeah. I guess for me, what I'm always looking for are stories that illustrate a point. So I could talk around and say, well, okay, this is that point. So I've got a number of my own business philosophies that I'm always looking for examples of. And for me, the examples there might be about, you know, about standing out from the crowd, about the importance of being different, and something kind of simple like that. Now, you could turn around and go, you might find an example of that, a great story about a business that's doing something extraordinary and it's different and it illustrates that point perfectly well. And you go, yep, that's a great example of that. So then I kind of put that into my own little spreadsheets, which I have. This is a great story to illustrate this point. So in all of my work, I have, you know, a pile of different philosophies, keys, views. I'm always looking for examples and anecdotes to add to the list to illustrate, so that I'm not kind of telling the same stories time and time again. You know, as a presenter, there's nothing worse if people have seen you a few times and you're kind of just recycling the same story. I just think that, you know,
funny
you
should say that, because I did a conference keynote address. Well, the first year I opened the conference, the second year I closed the conference, and they were mad enough to ask me back a third time to run more of a, you know, a workshop-y kind of event. And I didn't tell a story that's, you know, what we call a signature story, as you would know. Yeah. I didn't tell this story because I thought, they don't want to hear it 3 times, surely. But the client was actually very angry with me for not telling it, because he said there were 40 people in that workshop out of the 60 people in the workshop who were hanging on themselves to hear it again, but there were 20 people who'd never heard it before.
I think you make a good point. I think you know, we have our foundation kind of backbone stories. What I try to do, and I have those as well, but I always try to introduce new elements So at least you're always kind of keeping it fresh a little bit.
Yes.
I had a very funny experience a number of years ago, maybe 10 years ago. I spoke at a conference for the solo guys. And I remember I talked a lot about my own personal story and business and my mistakes and what I figured out and all that kind of stuff. A fairly normal presentation that I'd done a number of times. And at the end of it, a chap came up, and I had like 7 strategies for doing business better, that kind of thing. And I had a chap come up to me at the end of it, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, look, Andrew, that stuff's all great, but I don't think anyone really wants to hear any of those kind of your stories. They come here for advice. Just tell us what to do, how to do it, rah, rah." And I went, "Oh, okay." So I took the one-person survey, and I left and went, "Okay, well, people don't want to hear those stories." And I remember for the next probably, 6 months, 12 months, I did that. I just delivered data, information, facts. And I didn't enjoy it for starters. I hated it because it just wasn't my style. But what I really noticed was my audience satisfaction just dropped because I was just telling them stuff they really could find anywhere. It was the stories that made the difference. And of course, ironically, what changed my mind was I met another fella who saw me present again, who was at that presentation that I did that a year before, and he came up to me afterwards and he said to us, "Oh, I really much preferred it when you told all your stories." And I kind of thought, well, okay. And two things. One, there is obviously the danger of one-person surveys, taking all that information on board. Yeah. But I noticed for me how much better I felt when I was telling stories and how much more I engaged with the audience. And again, that's very, very true, I think, in writing or in speaking. I think if you can tell great stories, you engage your audience. And yeah, I mean, I found this, Ian, with my publishing. The first couple of books that I wrote, I remember my publishers at the time, Alan Ullman, they sat me down and said, "Do you realise you have a great writing style?" I went, "I didn't even know I had a writing style. I wouldn't even know what a writing style is. I just kind of write." And I said, "You always introduce the problems with a really good story, and you explain it, and you tell the story like you're sitting in a room or sitting in a coffee shop having a cup of coffee with someone sitting across from you. And that's a really good writing style to engage with your audience." And I went, isn't that interesting? Because I had no idea. Who knows what your writing style is, And I found then when I started to look and to use that more, that is my writing style. And it's share a story, share an example, make it meet, let people know that you start with what they know, and then you can kind of introduce, well, and this is what we did, and this is the process we followed, and this was the outcome. So it's just a really simple format, and really that's the chapter structure in a book almost. Start with a story, figure out what went wrong and what you did about it and what the result was, and then inspire the reader to say, well, you can do this too, if they could do that. So fascinating stuff.
And really, it's kind of the simplicity of that, isn't it? That's what we hang on a story, even if someone's telling a joke and the punchline becomes obvious really early, we still can't wait for it to actually happen.
Exactly.
I mean, some of the great stories that I was at a family function at the weekend, and my brother-in-law and myself were reflecting on our 40-year relationship, and we were retelling some of the old stories, and someone said, you blokes dine out on these stories every time you meet. And it's kind of boring in one way, but in another way, it's kind of it's reaching into something archetypal. It's something that's, I think, built in all of us. We love that. Joseph Campbell called it the hero's journey, of course.
Mm-hmm.
We feel called to do something. We head off to do it. We get faced with a problem. The dragon comes. We beat the dragon somehow, and then we go back, and life's better. And everyone loves that structure, regardless of what's there. Yeah. Mm.
It is ingrained in us, and that's the thing to realise. Anyone who's done any work in Indigenous communities or with Indigenous people will be the first to say, that's how common ground is formed, by figuring out where you're from. So once you know where you're from, you know where you fit into the story, you figure out who it works, and that's why when you are in Indigenous places, everyone spends the first few minutes figuring out who you are, where you're from, and who you know, so that they can put you back into perspective. Okay, well, you belong to that mob over there. I know that person, so you're okay. You know, that whole. So rather than just saying, are you credible or not? Well, we got to tell these stories. We got to figure out who's who and work it through. I think with storytelling from a business point of view, though, there's people got to always understand that there's the right ways and wrong ways about doing storytelling, and I guess you got to get it wrong to get it right sometimes. But important for me is always framing the story. You know, to turn around to people and say, well, why am I telling you this story? Either at the beginning of the story or after the story, but you've got to make sure that there's some relevance around it, because I think sometimes we can assume that the outcome of the story is obvious, or the moral to the story is obvious, or the purpose of the story is obvious. But I think that sometimes people get caught in the story, and it's easy to forget the purpose of it. And I think that, like any kind of delivery, whether you're writing or whether you're speaking, that you do need to just be able to put a bit of that discussion around it. So I always tell people to study it, you know, just to frame the story for your audience, to make it easier for them to understand why you're telling it and what it means for them, and then, you know, what do they need to do as a result of that, which is, again, why stories developed for many years, you know, thousands of years ago. There was a purpose to them, really. It was, you know, it was either to keep away from an area, or to look after an area, or to remember that this happened in the past and there was a big fire here, or whatever it is. It's no different in our environment.
No, I agree.
Don't think to do that.
I mean, I as a general rule, follow a process where I will do exactly that. I'll frame it, share it, make the point again, and link back to the main point. Like, I think in an hour's sort of keynote style thing, you know, you've really only got one message, and probably 2 or 3 mini messages. And my process has always been, you know, you set the scene, you share it, you make the point, and you link back to the main point. And
you know, exactly.
It's like the old story was, you know, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them.
Yeah,
it's pretty much nothing much has changed. But I think the important points you're making around that are, it's got to be relevant.
Exactly. It's got to be relevant to them, doesn't it? You know, in some shape or form. Why? Or you know, another story, though, that I think people have got to get good at saying or talking about, and probably the hardest of any story, is for people to tell their story. You know, I mean, I had an experience with that. The first time I really told people my story, not my I'm a business guy and I do this, but my real story, you know, growing up as an orphan and growing up with a lot of violence in my childhood and all of that kind of stuff. I hadn't really told anyone that story, because who cares? Like, really, that thing. But I was invited to do a talk for Cairns Business Women's Club where I live. And I knew a lot of these people. And I said, well, okay, what do you want me to talk about? You know, marketing, you know, customer service, tell me. And they said, no, we've kind of asked around and no one really knows your story. No one really knows where you're from, your family. We assume that you're a Colombian drug lord, or you know, you're on the run from someone. And so I went, well, what am I going to say? So I got up and I told my story about everything that had happened in my life to that point where and there were ladies in tears and hysterics. And it's very hard, because of an audience where I knew, of the 200, 250 people in the room, I knew the vast majority of them very well. And it was really interesting for me. I was quite surprised by the reaction from people, because I sincerely didn't think people really cared. Not in a bad way, not in a no one cares, not like that. Just, you know, who kind of really wants to hear my story, you know. But I was amazed at the impact that I had, that had on me, but also on the other people. And I went, wow, people really do want to know the people in our lives or other people's stories. You know, like, it's why autobiographies are so incredibly, you know, successful and popular.
Yes. In fact, your story that's in your book. Me is the
Me Myth.
The Me Myth. Yeah, that's because I found it. When I read the Me Myth, I found it. It actually, I found it quite brutal, and I learnt something about you that I didn't know. It kind of shocked me. But what I also liked about it, though, was that it wasn't kind of It wasn't therapy. You know, there's some people who tell stories and it's all about them and it's all about, you know, that's a no-no. But so I like the way in the book where you told it as it was, but you kind of didn't go too far. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I didn't want to write that kind of book. For me, I wanted a book that I guess could be my realizations and my observations on life. And look, this is just what I figured out. I don't like preaching. I don't like that whole kind of thing. Leave that for the sermons. You know, leave that for the people that do it better. But it was a very, very interesting book to write. Again, simply because it gave people an opportunity to get to know you, just as that presentation, gave people an opportunity to know and understand me. But I think it's the same for all of us. If you own a small business, if you're a chiropractor, I think that these days consumers, we want to know more. We want to know, like, why did you become a chiropractor? When did you start the business? Where are you from? What do you do when you're not chiropracting? Why do you do it? I mean, I had this conversation with my optometrist a couple of weeks back. He's been an optometrist for 50 years. You know, he's been putting glasses on people, doing eye tests in a little dark room for 50 years. And I looked at him and I said, so Bruce, how long have you been doing this for? He said, 50 years. And I said, really? Do you ever get sick of it? And he said, I love it. Every day I love it. And I went, wow, that's very cool. That's very cool. And he said, from my earliest memory, all I wanted to be was an optometrist. He said, as a kid, I was devastated because I didn't need glasses. You know, and all the rest of it. And just, you find out more and more, and then you find out, well, about the family background, a Lebanese background. And one of his uncles was an optometrist who he used to look up to and admire. And you find out more. And instead of then just being this nameless, kind of faceless business, your emotional connection, it just goes so much deeper. And that's why I'm so big on saying to people, you've got to be comfortable telling others your story, particularly in the business environment. Why do you do what you do? You know, share some of that, the background, the passion, the whatever it might be. And because we go, well, who really cares about that? Your potential customers care about that. That's the whole crux of it for me. That I think if you're not telling your story, people, there's no opportunity for an emotional engagement. They're not going to have an emotional engagement because you're advertising your rate $79 for a house call. They're not going to have an emotional connection because you've got nice cars. They're not going to have an emotional connection, you know, because, you know, you've got a picture of a pipe getting fixed on a website. They're going to create an emotional connection because of you and who you are and why you're doing it and what you're passionate about and what you stand for and all those types of things. And I just I believe that that's the most important story we've got to tell, but it's also the hardest one for people to tell because it feels very open and exposed, and surely we should write in third person in a very formal way about our business. I'm going, absolutely not. You should be writing first person from you, you know, like you're having a cup of coffee with a prospective client. You know, read my website. It's all first person. That's the way that I've written it. And I notice how much more engaged people are already just by having a website that is me to them rather than, you know, the omnipresent corporate voice talking down, you know, that type of thing.
I'm exactly the same. In fact, I'm increasingly, this has become absolutely key to my work. You know, there's a lot of talk out there about business to business, you know, B2B, B2C. I think it's just nonsense. You know, what we want is human to human.
Exactly, H to H.
H to H, you know.
H to H, yep. I couldn't agree more, Ian.
And technology is fantastic. Here we are using great technology. It's fantastic, but it doesn't matter how good artificial intelligence gets, in my view, nothing replaces human to human. And as you say, it's about connection, and all the great stories connect human to human. That's what they do.
Yeah, and it's easy, you know, too, that if you're telling a story to someone in a workshop environment or even in a book when you're reading a story, we relax. Physically, we relax. We breathe easier. We breathe slower. Everyone puts their pen down and listens. You know, that's the only time people really give you that full attention is when you say, hey, I'm going to tell you a story that had a huge impact on my life, or I'm going to tell you a story of death, mayhem, and disaster, or whatever it's going to be, and people resonate with that. And I think we're learning to reconnect regardless of technology, regardless of everything else. And I think that that's what's very exciting, and that's what's wonderful in the business world these days.
Yeah, look, I actually think this is why the resurgence of storytelling and why it's become significant and why it's a buzzword, today is for this very reason. We talk about connections on LinkedIn, but how many of them are actual people that we know as fellow human beings?
A handful. I've got a couple of thousand connections on LinkedIn, and I probably know 100 of them. Maybe I don't know. But certainly not even close to 30% of them. Yeah. I wouldn't have thought. So yeah. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of ironic, really, isn't it? That whole thing. It's about collecting numbers and names and feeling that we are connected. But I don't know. I was just going to share an interesting kind of an example. I did a presentation a few months ago now in Sydney to 500 people from the BNI chapters at the annual event, and it was really an interesting one. And the topic that they wanted me to talk about was storytelling, and it was probably the first time that I'd really done a keynote presentation on storytelling. I'd done presentations where I kind of incorporated. This was all about storytelling, and it was all about how I use storytelling in writing, in presenting, about finding ideas for stories, about why it's important, about talking about your successes, like in business. Talk about the things, the projects you've been really successful. We'll tell the story of that project. Yes. Like how did the person come to you? Why did they come to you? What was the challenge? What was that? And this was an amazingly captivated audience, and I didn't realize it, but they're saying that in BNI, it's all about storytelling. You got to get up and share your story. You got to be doing this at their events. It's been a long time since I've been to a BNI event, but it was all around that. So these people were already believers. They'd already drunk the Kool-Aid, and but for them, it was really interesting to see how engaged they were about looking at different ways of telling stories, where to find the ideas for the inspiration. And I found that fascinating. And I used a couple of examples about how powerful storytelling can be to change an opinion of an organisation. And one that I'd like to share here was, and again, I don't think I spoke about this on our last call. Isn't that terrible? I do a lot of these interviews and I forget, did I talk about that? Have I forgotten about that? And I was on a flight from Launceston to Melbourne last year, I think it was, and it was a Jetstar flight. And I'm not a big fan of Jetstar. I'll be the first to admit that. But it was the only flight I could get. It's only a 35-minute flight, rah. Anyway, I'm sitting in the plane, and when we're waiting to take off, there's a chap in a white shirt who's kind of wandering around saying hello to the flight crew, walked up to the cabin and went in with the pilot. So I thought, wow, it's all very relaxed here on Jetstar. You just wander around, and I thought I might try and land this little baby when we get to Melbourne. Anyway, the plane takes off, and the chap comes back up to the front of the plane again, and he asked one of the flight attendants if he could just make an announcement. I'm going, God, this is really relaxed, and he's going to sing karaoke. And anyway, so he picks up the microphone thing, and he says, "G'day, folks. I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is I've just forgotten his name now. David Farmer, I think it is. I'm the CFO or CEO, I think, for Jetstar." And I just want to say, thank you for choosing to fly with us. For whatever reason, maybe it was convenient, maybe you're a fan, maybe it was the right price. But I know that you've got a choice, and I know that it's a competitive space these days. And for whatever reason you're with us, I want you to know that we appreciate it a great deal. And we've got 10,000 staff that appreciate it. And most importantly, we know that we don't get it right all the time. We know that we make mistakes, and we're always trying to do better. One thing we never compromise with is your safety. But the other stuff is irritating for you if we're late or if we, baggage problems, whatever. Anyway, I'm going to be sitting in seat 12A for the rest of this flight. If you've got a story you want to come and share, good or bad, come and tell me. Come and find me and tell me about it. And thanks again. Sorry to disturb you. Hung up the phone and went down the thing. And I found that was quite an extraordinary thing to say. Like my entire opinion about Jetstar changed with that one man's conversation. Now, he didn't do it on a flight from Sydney to Perth, right? It's like it wasn't a 4-hour kind of bombardment. It's only a short flight, but it was genuine. It was very authentic. It was very sincere. And I kind of looked at that and thought, wow, what an amazing leadership thing to do in that environment. Now, I tell that story a lot because it really did change my opinion, and it shows to me how really one great person talking can really change a view. Now, obviously, I'm telling the story about my experience in there, but it's a great illustration again. And that's that point that I made earlier about this, and you made, there's so many ways, places where we see stories in action. I found that quite an extraordinary thing, how it can and how I changed my view of this organisation that I had a fairly low opinion of so easily. And why? Because all of a sudden there was that connection, there was that engagement, there was that fellow. I buy a ticket now and I think of him. And I kind of go, well, I want to support these guys. I go, where's that coming from? It's as soon as we make it personal, everything changes.
Indeed, and it's interesting how a couple of things for me that came out of that. First of all, most people think that most CEOs aren't human.
Yeah, exactly.
So he just dispelled that myth in a blink.
Yep.
The second thing is, I bet, how many people were on that flight that day? 150 people?
Something like that, yeah.
I reckon 125 of them have retold the story.
I guarantee it. I guarantee it. Time and time again. I've said it to probably 50,000 people in that period of time that is shared it with, written about it for Inc. out of America again. And that's one little speck, me kind of talking about it. And you go, wow, that's the power of great storytelling to spread, great ideas. I mean, we're seeing it through TED, now TED Talks that are basically storytelling. We're seeing all of these different ways to move the world. I don't think we're trying to convince anyone of the importance of storytelling, but we kind of are at the same time. Because I do find that you almost have to defend it a little bit.
Well, I think we do, but I think also what we're really saying is that fundamentally stories of significance are about being human.
Yeah. Yep. And when you can tell...
And being human when you tell them.
Absolutely, and that's another key, isn't it? Is that authenticity element comes out of it, that ability to say, well, we're human. I find one of the greatest ways to create connection with an audience, and I'm sure you're the same, is to laugh at your own mistakes, is to use that humor about what you've got wrong, is to as I say, exactly what I was saying before. I talk about my dive shop and how many mistakes I made in that business in the first couple of years, which is, and I even say the line to them, I bet you're feeling inspired about the business advice I'm going to be offering you after hearing about how badly I got it wrong. But ironically, they are.
Well, the other thing I think too, which that kind of illustrates, is what the CEO of Jetstar did that day, is he was willing to be vulnerable.
Yes.
Because he could have sat down. He could have sat down in 12A and copped abuse.
Well, absolutely, and look, it's pretty well guaranteed that there'll be more people going up there saying, "Well, you lost my luggage in Bali last week," as opposed to, "Well, I did a flight from Bali; it was fabulous." You're pretty well guaranteed that that's a take it on the chin kind of move. Very, very good leadership. Very, very good leadership in so many different ways. And I just, I was blown away by that. But the point, I think, from a storytelling perspective, there's many points in that, but is you're right around vulnerability, even talking about someone else's vulnerability. If you find it hard to talk about your own, which a lot of people do, and I think you need to, but if, talk about someone else's vulnerability. So I can share that story, and that's someone being vulnerable and explaining and being very open. Yeah. If that is easy for you to do, for those people who kind of go, because I meet a lot of people I know in doing presentation training and even writing, teaching people to write books that they can only be so vulnerable, and there's a limit. You've got to ease yourself into it. And I was certainly the same. But what I do find now is when I share the stories and I'm really open and really vulnerable, whether it's in writing or in speaking or whatever it is, you get such incredible engagement with your audience. Once they know that you're fair income, you're totally authentic, you're not a bullshitter, they will just they will listen and they will engage, and they will, they might not be dancing around and doing that, but they're thinking and they're taking it in, and that's what we want to do. How we want to connect with people, surely.
Yeah, and I think self-depreciating humour is a key to that. I know probably 75% of my stories that I share in presentations and even in coffee shops in one-on-one, self-depreciating it with a bit of humour. The joke's on me, because straight away the audience says, "Hell, he's one of us."
Yeah, exactly. You're not. It's like I don't know. I saw an event, a speaker a little while back, and this guy, it was a few years ago now, and he got on stage, and basically his opening line was, "It is so freaking expensive to get Lamborghinis serviced in this town. What's going on?" It's in a regional part of New South Wales, and it's kind of like, and he kind of thought that was funny, and you got 300 small business owners in the room that are trying to pay the rent on Friday, and what you've done is you've created this instant disconnect, and you kind of go, well, that's not the way to start. It's not really a story, but it's just everything is wrong about that story.
Well,
but
we have a language for that guy. We probably can't use it in a public forum like this.
But I think, again, to go deeper again on that concept, is when it comes to individuals that are telling their story, I know that I've learnt a lot from looking at other people, other presenters, and certainly other writers. I read a lot and try and figure out, well, how do they share their stories? How do they do it? It's like, obviously the TEDx and the TED is a great environment to watch people sharing their stories. Amazing example. If you want to get better at telling stories, I say to people, spend an hour a day on TED. For a month, spend 30 hours of your life and take notes. Why did that guy connect? Why did that? It's not the best speakers. It's not the most polished. In fact, it's far from it. It's really, why did that person's story resonate? They didn't have the biggest voice. They didn't have the biggest story. They didn't have the biggest, PowerPoint presentation. They didn't have any of that kind of stuff. Generally, you could just tell that they're passionate. They were honest. They were authentic. They were, they want to change the world. That's always kind of nice. But they, you could believe in their message. And I think that's certainly what I've done a lot of. And going to conferences and seeing other speakers even coming up and going, you know what, yeah, like, did they connect with their audience? That's the first thing I'm always looking for. Did they they connect, or was there no connection from the beginning? And you go, right. And I'm not looking to find fault. I'm just trying to get better at what I do and learning from what others do. And I think the advice that I give to anyone, if you want to be a better speaker, go and see lots of speakers. If you want to be a better storyteller, listen to other people that are telling stories, whether it's written, spoken, digital, doesn't really matter. But look at how people are telling stories and see things like how in their spoken word, how they do it timing wise. How do they deliver it? How do they, good storytellers talk slowly. They're not fast talkers.
No.
They know how to pause. They know how to frame the story. They know how to say, that's what I got out of this. They know how to make allowances if it's a complicated story and some of the audience might not have got the point. They don't make you feel dumb by sharing the point. You're self-depreciating him and saying, I didn't get it either at first, and then it dawned on me and that's all those little tricks that you go, what a very, very clever storyteller that person is.
Yeah, in fact, I was just I've got a notepad next to me here, Andrew, and I just wrote down that stories. If you want to share a story and it's going to be significant, it's got to be real, relevant, and resonate.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's and I think you've got to get better at telling them. You've got to practice it. I mean, like I've told my personal story many, many times now, but I keep trying to make it better. In terms of not to embellish it, but just to time it better, to make it relevant for the audience. Otherwise, I can just be saying my story, but it doesn't link back into individuals. I find telling stories is different for men and women. If I've got an audience full of blokes, I will tell stories differently to if I've got an audience full of women. without a doubt, absolutely without a doubt. I find, and again, I know that you emotionally get that as well, of course, because women are from the heart. And I know that's generalising, but women will connect really quickly with stories and authenticity. Blokes, there's a bit more cross-arm stuff. It's kind of a bit more, well, you got to tell me why I'm going to listen to you, fella. You got to prove that I need to pay attention. There's a bit more, the blokes can be a bit harder on that side of it at times. But once you win them, the arms start uncrossing, you kind of know, well, now they're lightening up a bit. So you tell kind of different stories to suit that, I guess, is probably, my moral to that story as well. That's why, again, we said before, you got to know your audience. It was, yes. I changed my stories depending on the demographics of the audience, age group, everything.
And I heard a word there when you were just sharing that. You used the word embellishment.
Yes.
And I get asked a lot, how much of your stories have been embellished? So I'm interested in your reflection on that.
It's a good point. I get asked it too all the time. Like I used to, when I would tell my personal story about my childhood, I would get people come up to me and say, "Is that true?" And I thought, "Oh, is that interesting?" And or they would come up to me and say, "Oh, I thought there was going to be a punchline because you were a marketing guy. I thought it was going to be that's how you market, or that's how you tell stories, or something like that," which of course didn't come when I'm telling that story. So for me, I certainly don't embellish it, but I'm getting better at telling them, I think, is probably the thing, that I'm just better at knowing when to pause, when to speed up, when to stop, when to give the audience time to catch up, particularly when you're talking about heavy duty things. If you're telling a story perhaps about your past, and I talk a lot about, growing up with a lot of violence, that's not something you can just kind of breeze through.
No.
But I used to talk about my childhood a lot more, and in quite a funny kind of a way. And people struggled a little bit with that, like, this is kind of bad juju, and you're kind of almost making a joke out of it. And it's like, well, I do that as a way to make it less painful for the audience, or less confronting, or whatever it might be. But I don't kind of do that as much these days, because I find that I just find that it's that's too hard for people to manage at times. Like, I need to be sad, or I need to listen, this is terrible, rah, rah. And this guy's kind of cracking jokes. It just it's a thin line that I'm still working on, trying to get that out there. But so I don't know that I necessarily embellish, or I hope I don't embellish too much, but I definitely work to deliver better, is probably the way I look at it, Ian.
My answer has always been, when asked the question, that with the story I share with you is absolutely true. But what I have done is use some poetry and some license to make it real for you, and make it alive for you.
Yeah, right. Nice.
That's always my answer, because if you take the bare facts of a story,
it can be dry, right?
You haven't necessarily got the something that's going to be real and relevant and resonate. So you got to do. I think you got to find the art of it.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, great point.
So look, we're coming towards the end of our time, Andrew. Have you got any? There's been lots of gems, and I thank you so much. Have you got any other reflections that you think would be valuable?
The only other thing I would say is two things. One is that whole point about if you want to get better at storytelling, you've got to tell stories, and you've got to be brave enough to get it wrong. You got to after you've written something, whatever it might be, you got to reflect on it. So I do a lot of that after every presentation, after something like this, after I write an article and I see the responses. I review the stuff that I've done a lot, and look at how would I have delivered that differently? How could I have made that more engaging? How could I have done that, to reach the audience a little bit better? So for me, a lot of self-review. The second thing that I have, which I think has been so beneficial for me, and I learned this from a comedian friend of mine, and I didn't realize this, but all comedians, he said, every comedian's got a little black book, and that little black book is filled with all of their anecdotes and stories. And so whenever you're going to go, you're putting together a gig for tonight, you can go through your black book and all the stories and things that you've got in there that you forget about. If someone said, tell us 5 anecdotes from your life, most people go, I can give you 1 or 2. We forget. So I have a story spreadsheet, and I literally have anything that I come across, which is a great anecdote that I could share. I've got it categorized like my own personal story. So I've got like 100 or so experiences, things that happen, that have, and what the point is beside each of them. Then I've got probably 100 customer service kind of anecdotes that I've encountered or come across. I have marketing ones. I have managing your money, everything from social media, all the rest of it. So I have these hundreds and hundreds of anecdotes and stories. So whenever I'm planning to do something, a presentation or to write an article, I refer back to that all the time. Because you forget. Your brain just goes, I forget about that. I forgot about this. That's right. That's perfect for this. So if the skew of my articles around customer service, I've got 100 examples to choose from. I only need 1 or 2 that I'm going to put in there. Or a presentation, it really only takes you a few short minutes to put a presentation together because you've got all your stories there. So I really encourage everyone to start a story spreadsheet, or a story book or whatever it is. And that to me has made my life so much easier as a storyteller, writing, presenting, whatever format it might be. So that's the last bit of advice that I would give.
Yeah, I agree. I've got several black books, and I love that. Many years ago, there was a story. It was a TV show, and it said there are 1,000 stories in the naked city, and this is one of them, or something to that effect.
Right. Nice.
And it's like we've all got 1,000 stories, and sometimes I know myself even if I've researched the work, I'm ready to go. I might be even standing in the wings, and sometimes I will just take a look at that book, and sometimes I'll have it with me, just in case something comes to me in the moment where I might need a jog, and share that story. I don't know about you, but I'm big on being very well researched and very planned. But then it's about planned spontaneity, as we call it.
Exactly.
But if you haven't got the spreadsheet, or you haven't got the book, or it's not as easy to be able to be spontaneous in a planned way.
And we just forget stuff. We forget stories. I look through these lists and I go, God, that's a great story. I've just forgotten, I'd forgotten about that. I'd just forgotten about that experience, which is just perfect to illustrate this scenario or this issue or this challenge or this whatever it might be.
Yes.
And I think that's the part. We just got too much other stuff rattling around in our brain. I find it keeps my stuff fresh, because I'm adding to these lists every day, as we were talking about before. You got 10 ideas for stories before breakfast type of thing. Well, these are living documents. You just keep adding, and every day you're having more life experiences. And how did I handle that? How did I work with that? How did what did that mean to me? And you have this wonderful resource. It takes away a bit of that. The overwhelm that can sometimes come when you start talking about storytelling, that people can feel, that they just can start to feel overwhelmed, that it's just too much, like where do I start? Where do I do this? Where do I do all of that kind of stuff? Well, start with a list, start putting them together, start listening to other people, start small, tell the story about why you got into your business, start telling a story about someone you saw the other day did this, on the way to work the other day, this happened. And then what does it mean, and frame it. I think that that's the best bit of advice that I can give, is to start small and then just do it more. I'm doing a workshop in September to pilot CEOs, and one of the big elements of that workshop is going to be storytelling. You wouldn't have imagined that would have even been an opportunity or a thought 5-10 years ago. Yeah, that shows how the world is changing, isn't it? That to me is extraordinary, and I love it.
There's no doubt. As I say, it's I share with my clients that there are 8 roles that the 21st leader plays remarkably well. And one of the 8 is being a story sharer of significance. And I've had that in my work for many, many years. But it's right now it's probably top of the list for what many people want to share. So look, folks, those folks online, if you can just hang in there for a little bit, and we'll come back in case you have questions. But I just want to end the recording bit, so just hang in there, Andrew. But thanks so much again.
Always a pleasure, mate. I always enjoy our conversation.